Hello, everyone. Welcome to another 3D Total interview. Today, we have the amazing Steve Forster with us today. If you're not familiar with Steve, he's a phenomenal painter who focuses on capturing individual stories through his vibrant and expressive portrait paintings. Steve also teaches and shares information with aspiring artists at the Long Island Academy of Fine Arts. So, thank you so much for being here with us, Steve.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Definitely. I've been looking forward to this interview for so long because I can show you, just real quick. I recently got my hand on this, and you can see right here. It's been super helpful. I haven't gone so far, but like so far, your chapter really informative, and I am really excited to dive deep and talk about this more. But before we get into that, can you personally take some time to just introduce yourself and share a bit about your artistic background and how you got to where you are today as an artist?
Sure, great. Yeah, I'm Steve Forster. I grew up in Florida, and my first school that I went to was, well, I guess before we get to that, just saying there's sort of three foundational experiences that I've had as an artist, and one of them was at the Florida School of the Arts, where it was sort of a broad introduction to art. There was dance there was theater there's graphic design, photography, and it was just a really interesting, broad overview to art making for me. And I also it was in this rural place in Florida, but I also met some amazingly talented artists, met my best friend, Steve Bauman, there, who's sort of also a fantastic portrait artist. We were roommates together there at the Florida School of the Arts. But at the end of that, both of us really wanted to kind of get more specific with our training. You know, a lot of the college experience is kind of like a broad educational experience, and that was very cool. That was a great foundation. But then both of us went to the Florence Academy of Art, and there it was very specific. It was almost like an artistic boot camp where there was a right and a wrong way to do things.
Oh
And
yeah, I get it.
and that was not something I had experienced in art. You know, art was kind of like this wild and subjective, fun thing, and there it was a little bit more of a stringent activity that was serious. It was actually a fantastic experience because you got to just build a foundational vocabulary of realism. You could go to many different schools to do that now. Back then, there was just maybe a handful, but it was so nice to just kind of learn away and then kind of be able to depart from it. And maybe some of the difficulty nowadays is that there's so many things to be exposed to. It's hard to have like a foundation like that. But that was really formative for me, is going to the Florence Academy of Art and doing all that, French academic stuff. And but then I went to the New York Academy of Art, and they didn't give a dink about any of that stuff. And
Oh really?
oh yeah, well yeah, the Florence Academy at the time was kind of like being in a museum, like being in this
Mm.
amazing place in Florence, and kind of going through this French academic experience. But then you go into the city, into New York City, and it was just more of a broad conception. It was like an introduction to the 21st century. I had been living in a different century, and then I went there, and it was just a really great experience in how maybe the skills that I had acquired would sort of translate into being an artist, like and being more of a contemporary artist, perhaps. So it's basically two ends of the spectrum, and it was really a beautiful thing to try to sort of synthesize that. And I've kind of been trying to synthesize those things ever since I left the school. So, but I still teach there at the New York Academy of Art, in their CFA program as well as online. And I
Mm.
run an art school on Long Island with my wife, Rebecca, who I also met in Florence.
Oh,
So we've been running this art school here for probably about 7 or 8 years.
That's great. It's really great to hear more about the artist's background and where they came from, where they began, and how they kind of found their voice. It's always just so interesting to hear because, every artist has a different journey and a different story to share. And I really just love listening to artists like say where they came from because I think that's also very important to the art they create and everything. So thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you so much. So now we can jump right into this book. I'm telling you, this book has been life changing. I kid you not, it has been life changing so far. And I just want to talk more about this. So, for those of you who are not familiar, this is the beginner's guide to creating portraits. It features so many artists, including Steve, who wrote a huge chunk of this, if I remember correctly. Can you share and talk a bit more about your contribution to the book? And yeah, just tell us a bit what the viewers or maybe someone who's interested in getting this book, what can they expect from the book?
Yeah, well, when they asked me to write the first three chapters, which was sort of a introduction to the beginner's guide to portraiture, I mean, obviously I was honored and everything, but I didn't know exactly quite what it would be. I knew 3D Total, and I owned several of their books. I love them as a publication company. They're always publishing things I want to see. And I think the main thing that artists want to see and people that want to learn art making, this book has. It has beautiful images. All
It
right?
does. Stunning.
I hate it when I buy an art book and it's all text. Like, what is that, right? So, for one thing, beautiful color images of some of the finest digital portrait artists that are working today, and as well as traditional media. There's some great reproductions in there. And the general thing, because the images are so beautiful, it kind of distracts you from the structure of the book because you just kind of want to keep turning the pages. But the structure of the book is that there's the first three chapters that I wrote are sort of about the creation cycle, or just kind of an attempt for me to explain how would you put all this together, like how do you draw and paint, and from my perspective. And so there's three chapters, one on drawing, and that covers line and mass drawing, and a bit of sort of the shape training that I got at the Florence Academy that's kind of influenced a little bit by like Barg and cast drawing. And then the second chapter is on colors and values and how those work together, and the difficult nature of sort of navigating the world of color value relationships, and how you can't really separate color from value, that they're married together whether we like it or not.
Exactly. Yeah, they are.
And that's complicated. Drawing's complicated, colors complicated. And then the third one was more about edges and brushstrokes and how that, creates form or creates more of a creative expression or helps you understand what it is that you're looking at, what kind of edges, the vocabulary of all that. And that might sound easy, but especially in the real world, when you're like an oil painter, that is really hard to navigate, sort of like having a vocabulary and a theory of edges. And then after my contributions, it was so cool in the back because there are so many different kinds of portrait artists. Usually if you get a portrait artist or a portrait book, it's going to be one person's take on it. And what you have in the back are case studies from some fabulous artists that work in very different ways. Something that's like very graphic and digital, like hard edge graphic. You'll also have watercolorists like Nick Runge, and then Justine Florentino, one of my favorite digital painters, as well some other illustrators, and so you kind of get like this realm of realism versus expressive digital versus kind of like an animator's look at portraiture, and it really spans quite a territory. I mean, I don't know if it's exactly a beginner's guide because there's so many good artists in there, but it's just a pleasure to flip through the pages and see all of those different takes on portraiture, as well as sort of the foundational aspect that I wrote in the beginning.
Definitely. Funny you mentioned it because I got sent this from 3D Total, and I remember I unboxing it and I flipped through it, and I was like so stunned, and I was kind of like, is this really a beginner's guide? But actually reading it, I think it's very informative, and the way a lot of like the fundamental theories are explained, I think it's really like easy to digest and really comes naturally. But I do want to ask you, who would you recommend this book to?
Well, one thing, and I kind of laugh because it said beginner's guide, but quite honestly, quite honestly, with like digital portrait painting and things like that, you can really maybe achieve things that are much more difficult than in the analog world. And so, the chapter on freckles, the chapter on glasses, when you're a digital portrait painter, that might be really helpful information in order to like push your portraits to the next level. Because I think a lot of people can start and begin the portrait, but there's different chapters in there that really would probably help people get much more specific and just stronger. I don't know if anybody wants to be considered a beginner. You know what I mean? And so there is that aspect of it, and I try to kind of give a broad overview. But there's so many different takes on that book in the back with different artists that you might resonate with this other person, and they walk you through their process. And so every chapter in the back of the book, every case study by the artists, different artists that were selected, they go through from the beginning to the middle to the end. So I mean, you still see the beginning of all of these paintings, and so of course that's going to be helpful to just about anyone. So I mean, I think we're really demanding nowadays from our art education. It's getting so much better with images and just the talent level out there. So really, when I look at the book, it kind of goes through beginner, intermediate, and some advanced things, and that to me is always inspirational. That was something that they had a bit at the Florence Academy, was that in the room with the beginners were also intermediate people and also advanced people. And so that would sort of like inspire and encourage and remind people who were advanced the basics again, because sometimes you start getting away from that. And so I really like it when something's dynamic and not just pigeonholed into one thing. And I think the book actually provides a great sort of beginner foundation, but it also shows some other advanced things that are kind of inspirational.
I totally agree. In fact, I think maybe the beginner's guide is more like how to start the portrait rather than like where you're starting from. I think that's a perfect way to think about it.
Yeah, how to start a portrait in a variety of ways.
Exactly how to start the portrait, because like there's so many tutorials, so like how to start and how to finish it. So like beginner's guide, no, you know. I like I said, I've been reading this. It's been so helpful so far, and one of my favorite chapters is when you talked about edge control, because that is something I as an artist have struggled with. In the past, before I started learning the fundamentals, I used to really admire like the brushstrokes and everything, but to be honest, I didn't know it was intentional. I just thought I or how should I put this? I didn't know how to be intentional with it. So reading that chapter kind of like broadened my sense. I was like, oh my god, yes, this makes so much sense. Soft edges for certain places, hard edges for certain places, and that kind of changed the way I like think when I'm putting down my strokes, even though it's digital. But like it kind of helped me know when to make certain decisions. I mean, a lot of it is intuitive, but like at the back end, I'm kind of thinking of all these things, right? But I want to ask, for example, my older portrait paintings kind of look messy, and I thought, I saw artists and their works were so expressive. I thought like if I make it messy, it's gonna look nice. But then I had no idea what I was doing. I wanted to ask you, what are some common mistakes, maybe this edge control that you see in beginner artists in their portraits that you kind of noticed, and what are some solutions you have for those common mistakes?
Well, yeah, that's kind of a great question. It's kind of difficult to answer out of a specific situation, but just I'll say it this way. I'll provide two situations. Like if you're a beginner oil painter, one of the problems is you can't make hard edges because everything's getting over blended.
Mm.
If you're a digital painter, often if when you're starting out, things are too hard edged because
Yeah, so it's the opposite. Yeah.
yeah, cause maybe you're like tracing it or outlining it, and then you're kind of
Mm.
coloring inside the lines or something like that. So those are like two common problems for people starting out in different mediums. And so it's usually a medium wants to do a certain thing, and you have to be able to kind of push it to do this other thing in order to provide like a range or a spectrum within
Mm.
that medium. Like if you're using willow charcoal, it's really hard to get the charcoal to stick to the paint picture. So kind of getting things adhered there is an issue. Or acrylic painting, you can't blend. So like blending is a problem. So one beginner mistake that has to do with materials is kind of understanding the medium you're working in and what are the problems of the tendencies that that medium has, and just being able to almost do the thing that it's not good at, like becoming
Mm.
aware of what that is, how you can control it. So that's one thing that's very situational to a medium. But other things, I think that blocking in
Mm.
heads and really honoring that is probably the biggest issue with beginners, is that we're drawn to portraiture because of the intimacy, the expression, the likeness, the look, the eyes, whatever it is, all of those nameable things. But underneath that is a base structure, kind of like in digital rendering. There's like a base mesh of a
Mm.
head or something like that, and so it's a weird thing to gain an understanding of as a beginner because it's somewhat abstract. And John Singer Sargent called it the wig maker's block, which is basically like an out of focus mannequin head of the person that you're drawing, and getting the nose in the right position, getting the overall shape right. It's kind of abstract. But to me, learning how to like sketch in a head in an hour and doing that like 100 times for the beginner, they're gonna lose interest. But
Yeah.
to me, that's going to be the thing that really kind of gets you there, and kind of gets you comfortable with the concept of like really, you know, rendering out ahead. Because really, after that, somebody just kind of rendering a nine, kind of enjoying and relaxing and just kind of letting it flow, that makes a lot of sense. But I think there's generally anxiety from beginners about starting a portrait, and so working up those chops of the block in to me is a big deal.
I definitely agree because the blocking is the foundation, and unless the foundation isn't solid, how do you want the final piece to read properly and get the exact proportions that you intended? I have that mistake as well. I have that bad habit as well. I make that same mistake where I kind of just jump into it and I'm like I'm gonna fix it in the rendering process, and then I get to a point I'm like, no, I should have spent more time on the blocking because the face is looking kind of wonky and the nose, and I know that if maybe I just spent an extra few like minutes or even an hour just trying to get the blocking right, it would have saved me so much time and it would have just made the process a lot more streamlined and easier. So yeah, I definitely think that's true.
And just to continue on that just for one more moment, because there's so many like opposite things. It's like, oh, okay, this painting's too harsh, blend it, and then you over
Mm.
blend it, and then there's nothing there. So the same thing with the block in. You can block it in, and then it can be incorrect. So to me, one of the big important things is also being able to ghost something out. And
Mm.
you see this with old animation where they'll kind of have like a rough sketch of something with like blue pencil, and then they'll like ghost it out and make a second version on top of their mistakes. to me, that's a real critical technique in blocking in is not just being satisfied with your first look, but having like a rough draft that's light, and then progressively, as you get more correct, it goes darker. So having a lighter hand and having several drafts of that block end is also very helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. That was really informative and really helpful. Thank you.
Cool.
So I also wanted to ask, I personally really enjoyed the chapter on edges, but I want to know what chapter you enjoyed working on the most. Like maybe a chapter that you felt like, oh, they don't share enough of this. I can't wait to share this. Or maybe a chapter you just had so much fun, or you think maybe this is a chapter that people should focus on. What chapter did you personally enjoy working on the most?
Well, I just liked working on the diagrams. I love trying
Of
to
course, of course.
I love trying to visually explain, whatever it is that I'm trying to communicate. Because when I first started, people would talk about things, but you couldn't see them. Like
Mm.
believe it or not, I had a teacher talk. I was like, "Hey, I want to know about color," and they were like, "Yeah, you got to check out this book by Joseph Albers, The Interaction of Color," and it was printed in black and white.
What?
There was like 2 pages in the back with
What?
color. I was like, what is this? So, anyways, but that was sort of like a lot of my art education. Was there were always sort of like whispers and talks about things, but like visually explaining things was not really a thing. And so I loved just kind of going through and making little diagrams. Not so much, my chapters aren't so much how to, there's not too many like, oh, this is my head from step 1 to step 10 or whatever it is. But they were more like theory. Like the edges chapter, I really like too, because it gives you a vocabulary of edges and how you
Mm.
might use that. Like where do you, and also within the vocabulary of edges, you could lean more brushy, but they're still sharp.
Yeah.
Or sometimes people lean real tight, like a Giotto, but there's still gonna be soft edges. So, like all four of those edges are in most really good works of art. They just kind of shift and privilege one of the edges over the
Mm.
other, and to me, kind of going through that and having like a theory or a vocabulary of edges is really helpful. It's very fun to understand and just kind of explain it visually. So I love making all of the diagrams. There's the palette layout one that I have, which maybe not so applicable to digital painters, but for analog oil painters or something, I felt like that chapter on the palette layout was really great, or really cool, if I may say so myself. And and just the whole I think that one thing that might be a little lost that I'm really proud of is sort of that creation cycle, that no matter where you're at, you can always take a turn on the cycle. So for me, when I make something, first I draw, then I put in the color values, then I kind of soften, and maybe there's some brush strokes, and then I do it all over again. Draw, colors, soften, draw, color, soften. And that sort of builds sophistication. And in a lot of my oil paintings, after I softened, I would just be like, what am I doing? Like, there's nothing left. I took away all of the excitement, and so like being able to redraw and just kind of know, oh, okay, I need to take another turn on the creation cycle. Like that's been really mentally clarifying for me, so I never have any excuse to like not finish something. There is always something to do, and it's kind of like a path forward, to where like I don't just, what, if it's not good, draw. And once you draw, it looks a little ugly, so you got to fill it in with color values. And then once you put in the color value, you might want to soften a little bit or think about your brushstrokes. And so that just always pushes me forward, even when I feel a little lost on something. That that technique, that formula, has always really guided me rather well.
Oh, definitely. I when I read the chapter on the formula, I was like, this is so like it was so informative, and like you said, you mentioned that the chapter wasn't really like a how to, it was more theoretical. And I personally find theory very helpful. Sometimes as artists, I mean, art is very expressive, but there's some kind of, you need to know some sort of theory in order to like achieve some certain type of like realism, or some certain type, no, okay, not realism, but more like readability that you're trying to convey. Maybe is that the word I'm looking for? So yeah, I really enjoy learning about the theory, and I think you really like broke it down. And I think this book, not only your chapter, but like every chapter, really did a great job in explaining the theory behind it, and not making it feel like a science class, but making it feel like actually entertaining and helpful. And everything just felt really, really easy to digest. That's one of my this is one of has been one of my favorite books. I recommend this to all my art friends. I'm like, you guys need to get this book. It's so helpful. It has really, really helped me so much. Oh, and Kelly, so on that note, I wanted to ask you. So it's a beginner. We already like we've been joking about the title "Beginner's Guide," but I do want to ask you, what advice do you actually have for absolute beginners? Maybe someone has always wanted to get into portrait painting, and or maybe just painting in general. What advice would you have to someone that wants to get into portraiture?
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot. Well, I mean, one of the first things is don't give up. you know.
Solid.
um, yeah, when you're learning art matters, it kind of feels like you can be in a ship without a rudder. Just kind of like, well, okay, which path do I go? Where do I go? Whatever it is. And I think there's a couple of things that could be really helpful. One of them is to find something that resonates with you, find a teacher,
Mm.
find a method. What is it how do you want to draw? Because there's so many different
Mm.
versions of portraiture, like in this book, right? There's so many different versions of it. Find that person that is doing the thing that you want to be doing, and just try to learn from them and really emulate that, and that will give you a path, like a specific path and a specific target, so it's not this nebulous thing. And maybe one other thing is the hardest thing about portraiture is that there are so many layers to it. There's the proportion, there's the values, there's the mood, there's the eyes, there's the freckles, there's everything.
There's the glasses.
Yeah, there's so many different things involving it, and it can just be overwhelming. And what I think is really smart, as much as you can do this, because it's very hard, is to pick a specific thing and work on that and get good at it, rather than living in a sea of mediocrity. Like, oh, you know what, I just did this, whatever. Like, learn, like, try to get really good at a block in for a month.
Mm.
Like, say, oh, this month it's going to be the block in, and then the next month maybe it's features, and then maybe the next month it's turning form or whatever it is. But just pick something really specific and try to get good at that thing, and almost block out other things, because there's just too much. There's too much to think about. And so if you pick a path and you get as specific as you can, I think you can identify what you're trying to do and measure your success. I think that's one of the definitions of deliberate practice, rather than just kind of, oh, I'm just going to do something. You pick a specific thing, you track your success, you name it. You say, I'm going to get good at this thing, not just portraiture. Portraiture is too vague. You know what I mean? So picking a specific
Mm.
target is really helpful, because then it simplifies your life and you can just try to get good at that one thing.
Yeah, definitely. That's solid advice. I thank you so much for sharing. That's solid. That's amazing. Yeah. I think a lot of people try to, they get overwhelmed because they're trying to do too much at once. And you just have to take it step by step and focus on this portion and this portion, and eventually everything kind of just works together, right? I think that's solid advice.
Yeah, and you know what? Working on a block in isn't going to be, people aren't going to get excited about that. So if that's not the path, if that's not the path that somebody wants to start out beginning, just draw an eye. draw mouth, pick something
Exactly.
specific, but the whole head with the hair, the nose, the eyes, the expression, the proportion, it's just a lot to handle. So you just try to pick one thing, and one thing that you want to learn, you
To
know.
get you excited
Yeah,
to learn
exactly.
others.
Pick
Yeah,
something you're
exactly.
excited to learn, very specific, and try to get good at that. That's right.
Yeah, totally. That's solid advice. Thank you so much. So, Steve, we've come to the end of the interview. I had so much fun talking about this book with you. If there's anything you'd like to say before we conclude, the table's yours.
Oh, I just want to thank 3D Total for asking me to write the first three chapters of the book. I'm just so grateful for that opportunity. I wish it could have even been longer. I loved making it, and I'm really happy with the final result. I'm not just saying that. I was impressed with the layout, the amount of artists, the images, the instruction. It was just a really solid book, and I just thank you guys for allowing me to contribute to that.
Of course. Thank you so much for contributing because, like I said, I absolutely love the book. And I'm sure everyone who gets a hand at this book is definitely going to get something out of it, whether it's just looking at the beautiful, stunning portraiture or actually learning the foundations of beginning a portrait. So, thank you so much.